All right, you guys.
Can you talk a little
Olivia.
louder?
Who is it, Katie?
Olivia.
This is my Aunt Mary, and you can call her Aunt Mary, Katie's Aunt Mary, or Mary.
Thank you. Hello. Katie's mom told me that you all were studying about quilts, and that if you had a quilt with a family history, your teacher would like someone to bring it in. And I'm visiting here from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So Katie's mom, Suzanne, asked me to come in and talk about this quilt. This quilt has been in our family for probably 100 years or more. It was made by Katie's great-great-grandmother. When I was a little girl and Katie's grandmother, Mammy, was a little girl, we would go to visit our grandmother. We called her Granny. And all the beds in the house were filled because there were so many people visiting. She would make what was called a pallet on the floor. She would take several quilts. She had many of them. And she'd lay them on the floor, one on top of the other, and then she would put sheets and pillows on top of that, and that would be our bed while we were visiting her. We would sleep on the quilts. Other times, the quilts were, of course, used on top of the beds to provide warmth. This quilt in particular, it's not a fancy quilt. These were country people. They lived and worked on a farm. They worked hard. They didn't have a lot of money. So the fabric that they had to make a quilt came in flour sacks. Do you all know what flour is? You know what flour is? Your mom probably has flour in your kitchen. She uses it to make a cake or a pie or to make biscuits. Well, our great-grandmother, or my grandmother, Suzanne's great-grandmother and Katie's great-great-grandmother, would get flour in 50-pound bags. Do any of you weigh 50 pounds?
I'm 60.
Okay. All right. Well, this bag of flour would weigh almost as much as you do. And it would be filled with flour. And from that, she'd dip into it when she needed it to make a cake or pie or biscuits or whatever. And she would save the fabric. It was almost as though they were early environmentalists. They didn't waste anything. They had no money to waste. They were poor. So when they were through with the flour in the flour sack, they saved the sack, and they cut it into squares. And they used those squares to make a quilt. And that's what you have here. A quilt. This was made in South Georgia in the early 1900s. And it's all made from flour sacks. That's one side of it with the bigger squares. And then you turn it over. And this side has smaller squares, and you see it has some triangles and a little bit of design. You know how they made this quilt? It was a social experience as well as a useful sewing experience. They would cut up the flour sacks into squares or triangles or whatever, and then many ladies would come over to visit our grandmother in the evening, mostly in the winter time. It would be cold. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have central heat. They had to have a fire in the fireplace, and they'd have a kerosene lantern maybe. And my grandfather would have built a rack in the ceiling of the living room. And they would pull the rack down, and all the ladies would gather around, and the fabric of the quilt would go on the rack, and the ladies would sit in chairs around it, and they would stitch. All of these stitches are by hand. Before they put it on the rack, they would stitch the little squares together, and they would make this one big cover. But then they put the quilting material in the middle and the other cover on the back, and they'd put it on this rack. They'd pull it down from the ceiling, and the ladies would sit around and stitch, and they would talk. And that's what they did for friendship. Like your moms maybe go to yoga class with their friends, or jogging or running, or maybe they have a craft. Do any of your moms do crafts with their hands? Do they?
Yeah, my grandma does, and does, like, cutting stuff.
Oh, does she? Yeah. Well, that's the same thing our grandma did.
I did hand stuff.
You do hand stuff? Do you sew?
my mom and me do, and my mom knits too.
And Katie's grandmother, Mammy, she sews too. She sewed a lot growing up. She had a beautiful sewing machine and she could make anything. I imagine she
My mom had a sewing machine.
And now she's given her sewing machine to Katie.
Mammy too.
Oh, it
I have a
is?
sewing machine. My mom used to have a sewing machine,
Oh, did she?
and she sold it.
Well, now this quilt, as I say, it's not a fancy quilt. This is not a quilt that you would see in an antique shop that would, or you ever watch the program Antiques Roadshow, that where they have very valuable family treasures. I don't think this would be one that would bring a great deal of money, but it's enormously valuable to us because it was made by Katie's great-great-grandmother, and it was given to me. Let me see, I had two of these. One was given to me by my grandmother, and one was given to me, no, one was given to me by my Aunt Minnie after my grandmother died. And then my cousin Sarah gave me another one. So I gave one to Katie's mom, and I gave one to her aunt. And now someday, Katie's mom will probably give this to Katie. So it will have gone through 5 generations by the time Katie gets it. It'll be a lot older, and it needs a little bit of repair. So the next thing we need to do, and you need to be careful when you do this with old things, because sometimes you fix old things and you do more to them than you should, and you can lose some of their value. So you see there are some stains in it, and there's some places where the fabric is torn. We need to take this to somebody who can restore it to, it'll never be perfect again, but to make it as good as it can be, so that when Katie gives it to her granddaughter, it will still be in good condition. Do you have any questions?